But welcome, and I'm delighted to be introducing our very own Kyoungmi Kim. Kyoungmi joined us last year from Loughborough University, London, where she was working on a team project investigating how people at multinational companies create and implement policies or norms across borders. Kyoungmi did her PhD in applied linguistics at Warwick University and is going to be talking to you today about her PhD project that's looking at how people interact with each other in a multinational company and address key issues emerging from the work group. And on the paper also that has recently been accepted for publication in a journal special issue that's called Critical Perspectives on the Management of Multilingualism in International Business. So Kyoungmi is going to talk about how participants talk about language barriers as one of the key issues during the research interviews, and also about language ideologies held by the participants. Okay, on that note, I'm going to hand you over to Kyoungmi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk about language ideologies and othering in the multinational workplace. So as Lisa said, the presentation is based on my research, and the paper is called It's Hard for Them to Even Understand What We Are Saying, Language and Power in the Multinational Workplace, which is going to be published probably next year. And I will talk about, I will focus on language and othering based on the paper. So as we know, most multinational corporations mandate English as a common company language to facilitate collaboration between employees who speak different native languages. So in such context, language becomes a tool to access a range of symbolic and material resources, such as professional roles or decision-making, information, network, and so on, thereby power and status in the organization. So studies have shown that there are status imbalance between native and non-native English speakers. So the paper is basically focused on how participants talk about language in the multinational workplace, and in the process, how language ideologies are enacted. So language ideologies are basically ideas and beliefs about what a language is and how it works and how it should work, which are widely accepted in particular communities. So the use of the term ideologies rather than more neutral terms such as beliefs or ideas points to a theoretical commitment to the idea that people's view about language are shaped by political and economic interest and by relations of dominations and subordination. So a typical example would be where immigrants or refugees are forced to learn and only use language of the host country for integration purposes. So that's where we can talk about language ideologies. So studies show that how languages are commodified and ranked in relation to dominant ideologies, which are produced and reproduced, or sometimes challenged in and through situated encounters. And studies also show linguistic differentiation is not a simple reflection of social differentiation, but often involved in othering individuals who do not share the same L1. And that is discursively enacted by actors with specific interest and agendas who want to, for instance, create hierarchical relations between language and the speakers of the language. For example, there are also studies that show how participants' discourses anchored in language ideologies serves to exclude bilingual and multilingual workers. So language ideologies manifest themselves in linguistic practice itself, in explicit talk about language. For example, which we call it metalinguistic or metapragmatic discourse. So the relationship between language ideologies and discourses is a close one. So discourse plays a fundamental role in the reproduction of ideologies, as discourse becomes a site whereby knowledge about language, linguistic competence, and skills are being articulated, formed, amended, and enforced. And language ideologies in turn, they shape and constrain our discourse. So the way we talk or frame our understanding of a language. So we should, so for example, one should speak English in particular way and map those understanding onto people. So research on language ideologies is important to discourse analysis and vice versa. So for analysts, discourse becomes an important site to investigate participants' knowledge about and framing of language, as well as its effects in their setting. So it is also a prime site to understand the emergent nature of social and ideological processes. So that's what I am interested in. So I want to understand how ideologies are enacted in our day-to-day conversation or in our research interview setting. So this is the research context. So EcoUK is a pseudonym of the company where I did my research fieldwork. So that's a Korean multinational company based in the UK. So as you can see in the hierarchy chart, so there are 3 expatriate managers, so transferred from the head office in South Korea. So we have Kiho, Jihoon, and Minsu, and they all have English name. And then we have 3 locally hired Korean employees and 1 Hungarian employee, and the rest were British. And so the structure of the company is directly relevant for analyzing participants' talk. As shown in the figure, the senior management consists of mostly Korean expatriate managers. And despite their relatively short employment in the company. So they were the expatriate managers were transferred to facilitate communication between headquarters and the subsidiary while managing subsidiary activities. So in most cases, the management changed every 3 to 5 years for logistical and visa purposes. So this means that local employees, despite their expertise and experience, had little chance to get promoted to a higher position in the hierarchy, as it is taken up by the expatriate managers. And so as you can see, most of them are have more than 10 years of employment in the company. So there isn't you can see interesting power dynamic here. So there are slightly less probably experienced in the headquarters, but most of the Korean employees are in the hierarchical position, and the British employees are lower in the hierarchical position. But then if we think about language, so given that English is used as a lingua franca, so there is also interesting dynamics in terms of language, right? So we've got native speakers, so I will call it L1 speaker from now, and we have non-native speaker, which I will call L2 speaker from now. So there is interesting power dynamics going on, and we are particularly interested in such power dynamic in such context, how language ideologies are enacted and what's the role that ideologies play in kind of balancing or imbalancing power relations in the workplace context. So I focused on accounting team members. This is because when I started my fieldwork, Jihoon was kind of relatively new manager at that time. So there were kind of interesting narratives around Jihoon's language competence. So there are 3 employees that I focused on. So we have Jihoon, who is accounting team manager, so responsible for various areas. So he worked for 3 years at Eco headquarters in South Korea. And when I interviewed him, it's been 7 months that he was working for Eco UK. And then Rita and Kelly, so these 2 people, they are accounting team assistant, and they've been working for the company over 10 years. and they were continuously under Korean expatriate managers, and they established close relationship between them. So in addition to the organizational hierarchy, so the relationship between the old timer and the newcomer as another layer to the power dynamics, which you will see in the narratives. So the data is drawn from interview data from an ethnographic case study of a British subsidiary of Korean multinational company, which is for my PhD research project. And ethnographic fieldwork, so ethnographic approach kind of allows in-depth understanding of the workplace context and communication practices. It also allows access to participants' background knowledge, which is particularly useful for interpreting participant account and their kind of background knowledge or their assumption. So, how I gained access to the company. So I gained access to the company through a Korean community where I was acquainted with ECHO UK expatriate managers. So given my subject position, being related to expatriate managers and as an outside of the company, the ethnographic approach is especially crucial to kind of build trust with the employees in the research process. And also our view is that the researchers are not a detached actor in their encounter, but situated and positioned within the research. And fieldwork is a social process in which the researcher and the participants constantly negotiate their roles and identities while establishing common ground. So we see it as a process. So and we think that it's very important to account for the impact of the researcher's subject position as a researcher, as someone who knows Korean expatriate managers and so on the research event, including the participants' talk and my interpretation of the participants' statement as well. So we treat interview, so when I say we means I and my co-author. So we treat interview as a situated encounter. So interview is a professional interactions that are jointly accomplished by the interviewer and the interviewee as co-participant. So this is in line with Goffman's view, which emphasized the importance of reciprocity in communication and the fundamental presence of the other in the public management of the self. So obviously in the interview setting, the participants talk about things in a particular way because influenced by the presence of the interviewer. So approaching the interview as a professional interaction or just as an interaction is useful for understanding how interview participants frame the particular topic in addition to what they say about it. So we are very much interested in how they say things. So in the presence of the interviewer, right? So we talk about impression management. So they like to present themselves in particular way because there is an interviewer listening to what they're saying. Yeah. So they care about our presence in the talk. And also it is beneficial to understand how language ideologies are mobilized for and with the interviewer, given that interviewer is the core participant of the encounter. Okay. So I used interactional sociolinguistics. So some of you might be familiar with this framework. So interactional sociolinguistics aims to understand how individuals participating in speech exchanges use talk to achieve their communicative goals. And by focusing on the meaning-making processes and the taken for granted background assumptions mobilized in the interactional process. So which means indexicality is the key to this framework. So indexicality means that the speaker's background knowledge or presuppositions are signaled or evoked by linguistic devices in immediate interaction. So basically, linguistic devices point to the speaker's background knowledge or or presupposition. So it helps us understand how and by what. So the focus here is that how and by what signaling devices language functions to evoke the contextual presuppositions that affect interpretation. Yeah. So what is assumed in the interaction? So that's the goal of the analyst to find out. And for this particular paper, it allows us to understand how individuals do ideology or enact ideology and what is communicatively intended in the interactional moment. Yeah, so that's what interaction social linguistics does for the analysis of interaction. So here is the data. So this is an excerpt from the early stage of the interview with where the interviewee, what's he called, Kelly, right? So Kelly talked about their experience at different companies, and the interviewer asked her practices that she found difficult to adjust. So so Kelly was the accounting team assistant, if you remember. So have a look, and I will talk you through the analysis. And let me know if you have any question. Yeah, okay. So her account overall, so as you can see in the title, enforces kind of the ideologies that continue to reinforce the native speaker ideal, which is the prioritization of dialects of L1 users of the language. So she starts off talking about a language barrier problem, which is followed by her assessment of language competence of Dan, or whose name is Taeho in Korean. So assessing the other's language, it has important implications here. So it firstly attributes the language barrier problems to others, so the manager's language ability, not that of herself. And secondly, so if you assess one's language, that means there is a benchmark for assessment, right? So hence it promotes the perceived benchmark, which is probably native speaker, right? Against which individual's language competence is evaluated. And it naturalized the assessor's linguistic authority, right? And thereby hierarchical relationship between the speakers. So although she mentions from line 15 that they themselves speak slang and speak fast and have accents, and that they don't speak proper English themselves, which are typically mobilized as native speaker symbols. So the ideological position she takes here is that it's the others, so L1, L2, or L3, or L4, and so on, speakers who need to adapt to the way the L1 speakers talk in the workplace setting. And the utterance here, we don't, where is it? Yeah, I didn't highlight. So we don't speak proper English ourselves. So it's interesting one, which cannot be read at face value, but rather the speaker's embracing of the language ownership, as our ideological position has been consistent that it is the L2 speakers who need to adapt. So her ideological position enacted here consequently marginalizes language minoritized group in the setting. And the pronouns, so in constructing collected images of the selves and others, pronouns become a useful resource. So with the pronoun they, so the managers, Dan and John, are ideologically represented as she picks out the qualities, such as not speaking very good English and not being able to understand. So the pronoun in this way serves to essentialize the individual's language competence. In juxtaposition, with they, the pronoun we represents the L1 speaker in the workplace, characterizing themselves with native speaker symbols and positioning themselves as an expert with language ownership. So linguistic differentiation in this way not only serves the group presentation, but also allows to question the manager's quality as a manager in the context of the team. And it becomes a useful interactional resource as well in front of the interviewer for positioning themselves as superior to the others, and thereby challenging the organizational status quo. So if you remember the hierarchy chart, right? So there was a senior management who are mostly from Korea, and then local employees based there. So language becomes language, or to be more specific, linguistic differentiation becomes an important resource for them to balance the power imbalance. Yeah, so to challenge the status quo. So we can also think about the role of the interviewer in the encounter. So what language ideologies do in the interview interaction is that they not only enact linguistic differentiation in representing themselves and the others, but also due to its shared and taken for granted nature, it makes it easier for the interviewee, so for themselves, to talk about or to tell the stories of us versus them to the interviewer. So in this sense, language ideologies are mobilized for the interviewer. So we also see how interviewer can be involved in the social and ideological process. So if you look at in line 18, so the question so the interviewer's question expresses her ideological position, so my ideological position, suggesting that Kelly could adjust her speech rate, right, according to that of her line manager. It is taken up by Kelly, as you can see in the short response, yet dismissed in her account of why she does not want to speak slowly, which is justified by the ideologies that promote how one should speak English in the multinational workplace, right? So she doesn't want to speak slowly because it might look stupid or something. In approaching interview as a situated, the last one is that in approaching interview as a situated encounter, we have also noticed some interactional features such as laughter. So laughter is mobilized when here formulating issues of language, and it provides non-serious framework where the speaker talks about her frustration. So imagine her saying very frustrated without laughter. So it would have been heard as a serious comment on the manager's language competence. So, and another reading of laughter is by treating the language barrier as a laughable matter, it may yet again enact her linguistic ownership. So in my data set, none of the L2 speakers laughed when they talk about language barrier issues. So that's another observation that I had. Compared to native speakers and non-native speakers, a way of talk about language issues. So laughter in this example is an important resource for the speaker to formulate issues. It kind of tone down or soften the way they talk about language barrier, and simultaneously managing the self in the interaction that involves the interviewer. So now we can have a look at what June says about language. So in June's account of his, have a look and I will talk you through the analysis. Okay, yes.
Can I ask a question? So this interview in Korean originally?
Yeah. So it was, so interview was done in Korean, and then the translation was done at the very last minute because I wanted to kind of maintain the meaning until I know what they are exactly saying. And yeah, so that's a very good point. So at the point, I would like to say that the people talk about language is never neutral. So whenever we talk about language, there are always going to be ideological position. So that's what I want to show you here, and also wanted to show in the earlier excerpt. So if you look at here in Jiun's account of his role responsibility in the kind of first half, so knowledge and language ability are treated as an equally important tool to manage work activities. And this annexes the ideologies by which language becomes a commodity or a key working tool for managing multinational work activities, where language acts as a semiotic marker for a specific quality or a source of added value. So if you look at his use of auxiliary verb, should expresses his ideological position that owning a language is a condition for an individual to gain access to professional role, which is problematic as it can significantly constrain his belief about how one is supposed to engage in communication across language boundaries at work, and potentially hamper his participation at work and undervalue his own worth as an employee, as other studies suggest. And another ideological position we can infer here is that himself, as an L2 English speaker, is solely responsible for communication, which resonates with Kelly's remark in the earlier excerpt that positions Ji-hoon and other managers as a linguistic minority that needs to adapt to dominant linguistic norm in their setting. So in this way, both parties authorize the L1 English-speaking employees as the language owner, suggesting that ideologies are collective. So ideologies regarding the status of L1 speaker and English language are widely shared among other employees, stating that, for example, we are lucky because English is the language people speak, and English is the global language, so we are lazy. So these statements appear to be harmless, right? And we often say this, not me, but English native speakers. But actually, ideological positions conveyed by those utterances are not harmless, as they reinforce the condition whereby L2 speakers are held responsible for their own linguistic marginality. Yeah? So when you say we are lucky, that means we don't have to make any effort, right? So they play an important role in producing and reproducing social order. In other words, a set of shared social norms. So based on the findings, we kind of the paper highlights that linguistic differentiation emerges in a situated moment. So it was interview setting, and it is produced within social interactions that are shaped by larger socio-political processes. And one of the key interactional resources for position and linguistic differentiation is one of the key interactional resources for positioning us and them and challenging the organizational status quo. Language ideologies are produced and consumed in employees' daily lives and affect them. And they are mobilized to perpetuate or challenge power symmetries in the multinational workplace context. So this course of linguistic differentiation plays an important role in othering, as language is one of the attributes that define other and is made salient and manipulated in the social context, such as exclusion, processes of exclusion, and it is actively involved in the process of constructing majority and minority identities within and between sociocultural groups. So othering is basically using representations and stereotypes about the other when meeting her or him and talking about her or him. And it is a very common phenomenon in intercultural encounters, and we do this, including myself, in our everyday lives to make sense of and explain away certain behavior or characteristic of individuals, or even to joke, right? So these people behave in this way because they are Korean, for example. So the problem of othering is that the categorical boundaries are imbued with certain meanings and they are inscribed in our mind such that they affect our behavior and inform our decisions, such as whom to be friends with or whom to hire and so on. And these are individual acts of discrimination. And when replicated across society and over time, individual acts of discrimination have a cumulative and magnifying effect that may help explain many group-based inequalities. So these are inequalities within and between groups based on ethnic, racial, and other socio-culturally defined divisions, such as inequalities of access to labor market or education, and so on. So we can talk about the mechanism of othering. So because the role of the discourse plays is huge in here. So although one might say it's just talk or a joke, that's what people say. So whenever they stereotype certain group of people, I say, don't say that, but they say, no, it's a joke. But yes, it's a joke, but it is through talk, stories or gossip or anecdotes and the like, individuals or groups of individuals are defined, represented, and feelings are expressed. And again, if the interaction becomes increasingly circular and reinforcing, they form a collective image of subordinate group and set a sense of group position. And once established, group-based identities may seem to so fundamental that we ordinarily perceive them as natural, and meanings ascribed to those identities affect our perceptions of those groups. So to summarize, the role that discourse plays in othering is significant, and it is through the discourse one way of conceptualizing, inventing the self and the other takes place. And those ideologies and othering are maintained, reproduced, or challenged. Which means that part of the solution to othering must come from the stories we tell, and in other words, our discursive practices matter. So my final point is that I would like to highlight the activist scholarship. So activist scholarship remains as important as ever. According to Haslanger, injustice is largely a social phenomenon, insofar as social meanings define our social practices and internalized meanings guide our interactions. Social justice requires attention to and changes to social meaning. So to challenge and change social meanings, which I believe is an important task for you, participating in increasingly diverse society, whether that would be your study abroad or working with colleagues from diverse backgrounds in professional context, there needs an increased reflection regarding the effect that the discourse we produce has under the current socio-political context and how it contributes to authorize ideologies that create conditions that allow marginalization of particular social groups to be viewed as natural and thus to become invisible. So this is what Wei calls multilingual criticality, referred to abilities to use evidence to question, problematize, and articulate views. And we, as a bilingual or multilingual, need to develop multilingual creativity, which is abilities to push and break boundaries between language varieties and to flout norms of behavior, including linguistic behavior, being able to tackle dominant language ideologies. So yeah, this is it. Any questions or comments would be appreciated, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you very much, Kyoungmi. Really interesting talk. Has anybody in the group got questions? Oh, hand straight up. Yes.
With the L2 and L1 members of staff, did you have other interviews with them as well?
Yeah.
Did you find the L1 employees, was it the general theme that they all used the othering when referring to L2 speakers and vice versa?
Not all of them, but most of them talk about differentiating themselves in terms of language. But yeah, the common theme that I saw was basically, which I introduced earlier, is that they feel they're lucky. So language is a lingua franca, and they said we don't speak Korean, so we can't complain. So that kind of attitude. So they don't really make much effort. So they do also. It was a shame that they don't really say that they try to accommodate the way the Korean speakers say. So they basically expect them to adapt the way they speak to the dominance of linguistic norm in the setting.
Thank you.
Can you go back to the slide of the structure of the company?
Uh-huh.
Because I just noticed there is nobody employed Korean and Hungarian.
Yeah.
Who are not native speakers English, is it, or is it they are grown up here and they are all fluent bilingual?
They're all immigrant, so yeah, they're all migrant.
Okay, but then it's more complex, isn't it? It's not only native speaker and non-native speaker.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of I don't know how much, for example, the locally employed Korean person position themselves. Is it more of the native Korean speakers or native English speakers? And then also I'm wondering what kind of role they are playing. If they are more fluent bilingual, are they sometimes helping the manager when they struggle? Or I just curious about what kind of dynamics those diverse linguistic background of people who are employed locally play in this kind of whole company.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was actually wanted to add what they say or the data in the paper, then it becomes too complex and too much, and my reviewers say maybe it's better to cut them down. But the thing is, so they are employed to help out the expatriate managers, right? So if they've been in the UK for a while, so they can speak more fluently than the Korean managers. So that's the whole purpose of employing the Korean speakers here. And their position was more like in between. So they get on well with the managers, but also get on well with the local employees. But also they struggle in terms of the power kind of relationship, because there's quite clear hierarchy between themselves and the Korean managers. But then what I found interesting was that they are fluent, but then they're not like, I shouldn't assess their language, but they're not like people like born in here, so the way they speak. But no one really pointed out their English competence. So that's where I feel like that the reason why they talk about language competence, that when I say they, is local British employees, probably they want to challenge the organizational status quo by talking about one's language competence. You know what I mean? So no one really talked about locally employed Koreans' language abilities. That's another thing that I have found. And Hungarian employee, so she was employed just mainly to communicate with the factory in Hungary.
So she's actually, her Hungarian ability is very appreciated in that context.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting, all those kind of complexity in the company and then the role each person is doing.
Yeah, so they are basically hired for their language ability.
Was that Chris's hand then?
Well, it wasn't. You were.
Oh, you just lifted your pen. I was just a bit quick off the mark. But you had your hands up, so.
Oh, yeah. So in the L1 example, they admitted they used slang and they said they don't use proper English. Did you have Did you see anything that would index what they thought proper English was? Because they don't seem to define it, but they also have the measure for the other people against themselves.
Yeah.
So was there anything, or did they just not say anything on it?
That's a very good point. We talked about this the other day with Chris. So the term language that they use was very abstract. So they don't really talk about what is the thing, but they just say it's language that we speak. We don't speak proper English, but they don't really specify what it is that they're talking about. So that's what I think language in my PhD. I kind of argue that the term language is used as a discursive resource, just to formulate certain issues. So instead of saying there is a power dynamic, there is a hierarchical issues, and so instead of saying this, they draw on language to talk about their story about the earth versus them. That's a very good point, yeah.
Oh, 3 hands. Okay, good. I think you got yours up first.
So you've shown us how the company already had a hierarchy to it initially, and pointed out how a language hierarchy, whether it like fully is developed or is just being formed or whatever, and it's parallel to it. It doesn't. How did those interact like outside of just language? Because you did point out there's quite clear native English speakers definitely position themselves above probably the Korean speakers, and then at the lower end would be the non-English proficient Korean speakers. But obviously, because it's kind of inverse to the company structure, did that affect anything else in it, you saw?
Anything else such as?
Anything besides the language, like the language created a separate hierarchy to the company's own hierarchy. I'd imagine those would be in quite heavy conflict then.
I think that's mainly the actual organization hierarchy and language. They are the main visible things. I can't think of anything really. So obviously there is nationalities. They talk about the Korean versus British. So the culture and language, they also go hand in hand. So they often talk about Korean culture in British culture. So that also kind of creates sort of contrast or dichotomy between these sociocultural groups. But it doesn't really affect the hierarchy, really. But then there's old timer. I think I briefly mentioned that there's old timer and newcomer as well. So they say they just came, they really don't know. Actually, one of the team assistant was basically saying, we just had a new manager and I need to train them because they've been there forever. But then they always have like new managers every 3 to 5 years. So that means they have to kind of teach their new managers. That's another, actually a power dynamic that is observed in the data.
Chris.
Thanks, Kyoungmi. In the data you have from Jihoon, I was just interested in your analysis, your use of the word ownership, owning the language. Could you tell us a little bit more about, did that come from the data or is that your interpretation, and what exactly you think ownership implies for ideologies and language?
Yeah, so it's my interpretation. I wasn't sure whether I should use this language actually when I was presenting this. So basically, the way he said is, but he is good. So he speaks good English from my perspective. So basically, expatriate managers they should have certain level of language, and so that they can work and in the subsidiary. But then I was quite interested when he said I should be more able to understand, or if I can communicate like 100% fluently. So this kind of utterance makes me feel like what is he saying? Is like, is it really owning a language? I don't know whether there's a better term, better expression. Instead of owning a language, that can be inferred from this utterance. Just let me know.
It's kind of taking responsibility.
Yeah.
It's sort of self-responsibility for it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just that the language ownership is discussed quite a lot in the world Englishes, global Englishes, English as lingua franca literature, and it is very ideological.
Yeah, I mean,
Henry Widdowson said to really own a language, you have to bend it to your will, and that seems to relate to on the last slide when you were talking about creativity, referring to the ways work.
Yeah.
And actually, so then it becomes using the language. If you use English in a non-native, particularly non-native way, that is, in a sense, where you own it.
Yeah.
And if you just use it according to native speaker norms, then
Yeah.
it's not yours.
Yeah.
You know, it still belongs to them, and that's sort of an othered version of English.
Yeah, I agree. I think I should change the wording. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
In Kelly's interview, when she talked about slang, you interpreted it as up to the L2 speaker to adapt to that. I almost interpret it as like an indirect apology, because that's just how British it is. And I don't think that I read that as the L2 speakers should learn British slang, because I think that's unnecessary. But I think the way that Kelly says it, it's almost as if, you know, I should speak proper English when I'm speaking to a non-native speaker because it's easier to understand. I don't interpret it as the L2 speakers should learn British slang. Yeah, so that's alternative reading, isn't it? So yeah, it can be apologetic, but I think what I saw was more like her position overall is that, you know, I don't want to speak too slowly, so I think they are stupid. So it's no one thinks it's stupid, right? So it's the way. So the idea. So it really talks about her position regarding how one should communicate across language boundaries in the multinational workplace, and it's okay to speak slowly. The purpose, the aim is to communicate clearly, right? Get the communication done. So it's basically, for me, the ideological position really tells me that she doesn't want to do it because it looks stupid, and it has to be elder speaker who has to speak as we do, or in a way we do in this multinational workplace setting. But that's another reading of the data.
Because I kind of interpreted that as me sort of thinking that we speak slang, so it's hard for them to sometimes even understand what we're saying as well. Was like, we speak slang, we're not going to change that. And I think the point about speaking too slowly, again, my interpretation was, I think there is a stereotype out there where people think that slow speaking is going to be perceived badly.
Yeah. But it also sounds apologetic because she was talking to me, right? So she is also managing sort of self presentation. So that's why Goffman's idea is important, is useful, because she says things in this way so that, you know, to kind of tone down or to soften the way she talks about language barrier issue. Does that make sense?
I'm just wondering if you have any additional data,
Yeah.
because you did ethnography, so you know those individuals quite well outside this extract, which help you to interpret this in this way, because that's what ethnography is strong at, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, there are. So I wanted to include some ethnographic observation as well, but then it's like, but the point is, I'm really focusing on the role of discourse. So my reviewer was saying, no, let's not go there. But anyways, so yeah, so there are. I have seen the kind of teacher-student relationship between the Korean and British employees at workplace. So when sometimes they make fun of Korean managers' pronunciation, sometimes they correct the manager's pronunciation. So they're kind of things I have observed. So yeah, so I didn't really see them trying to, I don't know, speak for the managers. I don't know, that was my observation, and also which then informed my interpretation of the data.
Anyone else? Oh, another question.
I noticed here Kelly says, I'm supposed to with regards to speaking slowly.
Yeah.
Do you know what she's referring to there? Whether it's any training or someone's asked her to, maybe?
I don't know, because it was prompted. So my question was, do you tend to speak to them slowly? But yes, I'm supposed to.
It sounds like she has an obligation to, if someone's asked, or she's received some training in communication.
Yeah. As far as I know, there wasn't any training or anything. But probably she's aware that she's supposed to do it, but she doesn't do it. I don't know. I actually wanted to give training, but then obviously they are busy people and they're like, yeah, we'll do it later. So I couldn't do it. But yeah, there wasn't any formal words for any training.
That's interesting. That's the ideological positioning, isn't it? Because it may not be the training, it may just be that that's what you're supposed to do with non-native speakers. You're supposed to view them as being linguistically deficient, and therefore you need to speak slowly.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say ideological position is not set in stone. It can be always negotiated in and through the interaction, isn't it? So it can be challenged. I could have challenged even stronger in this interview process. So yeah, so that's what we have to do, isn't it? So we need to challenge someone's ideological position, produce discourse that can challenge dominant ideologies and so on.
I feel that what you asked is almost like telling Kelly that she should do something, and then I feel like Kelly tried to respond to that kind of. I think that's what she said. Oh, I forget. I'm supposed to. It's more like saving her face towards you.
Yes. Yeah.
Because she felt like, oh, actually, I didn't do anything. And maybe she noticed by your question, or maybe she felt you challenged her why you didn't do anything. So yeah, it could be quite complex to understand what that means specifically.
Yeah.
Maybe audio recording, maybe some pronunciation, and maybe you can kind of interpret.
Yeah. I mean, so that's where I see interviewer as a part of the social and ideological process. And actually, we can talk about this excerpt like forever, because this is the one that I was most interested in. Whenever I see this, like I always find something interesting, and I really focus on like line by line interaction. But anyways, yeah, we can really talk about a lot of things with this excerpt.
Can I ask a slightly off? Well, I suppose it takes us off topic a little bit. But did you notice any gender factors? Because I noticed that the Korean managers that were at the top, I think they were all male. Did you think that played any part in?
I don't know. Would there be? What do you think?
I don't know whether that might have impacted on increasing the otherness, maybe in a sort of more males at the top, females in the lower levels. I don't know. I'm sort of throwing it out there, really. Just wondering what that might add to the dynamic.
Possibly, if I had focused on that aspect, but then because my focus was more like culture and language in the company, so probably I have missed that aspect. That's a good point. Yeah,
there could be something interesting in that. The other question I've got, which is a bit of a silly question, so apologies. Are they real names or are they pseudonyms?
They're all pseudonyms.
Pardon?
They're all pseudonyms.
Ah, right. Okay.
I don't even remember their actual name anymore.
Is it because there's Lisa?
I've never met another one spelled like mine. That's why. So that was why I was intrigued. Is that actually another one out there? Anybody else got anything? Oh, another question.
Can you expand a bit on what multilingual criticality?
Yeah.
I tried looking up the term and got nothing particularly explaining it so far.
Yeah, so if you're interested, you can have a look at Wei's paper, or is it where is it? Translanguaging as a practical theory of language. So Yeah, so it says ability to use evidence to question, problematize, and articulate views. So my understanding is that one should be critical about like dominant language ideologies. So whenever you encounter certain language ideologies, you need to be able to use evidence to question or problematize and articulate views on, for example, someone says, we are not just, I don't want to speak slowly because it looks stupid. So you need to be able to challenge that or tackle that utterance or whatever, or utterance by using evidence or by really problematizing it. So that's what multilingual criticality. That's my understanding. If you can add anything, what do you think? If you're familiar with translanguaging?
Really consistent with the work on the cognitive work on bilinguals and multilinguals. Their enhanced ability for divergent thinking and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of literature on that.
So it seems to be like critical discourse analysis, but specifically around like situations where there's two languages and specific discourses in those situations, and then being critical of that.
Probably more multilingual context, I think, where it's a multilingual. So being able to speak multiple language, you also need to be able to understand like political context and so on, and being able to challenge language ideologies and so on. Yeah, I don't know. That's my understanding.
I suspect it's more just the general ability to problematize and to see things from different perspectives, right? Rather than specifically metalinguistic.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay, so I think Kyoungmi's answered lots of questions, so I think it's probably time for us to bring the session to a close and perhaps move to sampling some lovely bakes. But before I do that, we have a raffle to draw. So I will leave you with Susanna for that bit.
Hi, sorry.